The Sunday morning silence shattered the moment Reverend Marcus Webb walked straight past Celia Rourke's pew without so much as a glance in her direction. Every head in Dusty Creek's small white chapel turned, every single one, because everyone in this town knew what that deliberate skip meant. Everyone knew the unspoken rules that governed their little corner of Texas in the spring of 1878. Everyone knew that the Rourke family pew, third from the front on the left side, had been occupied by Celia's family for 3 generations. Her grandfather had hammered those boards himself. Her father had been baptized in this very chapel. And now the new preacher, with his crisp black coat and his 2 clean boots and his cold, calculating eyes, had just walked past her as though she were made of air. The whispers erupted like a match dropped in dry grass. Celia felt the heat crawl up her neck. She sat perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap, her dark green dress pressed without a single wrinkle, her auburn hair pinned with deliberate care. She would not let them see her flinch. She would not give Marcus Webb, or the faction of townspeople who had apparently whispered their poison into his ear before his very first sermon, the satisfaction of watching her crumble. The pew behind her scraped against the wooden floor so hard and so suddenly that every whisper died instantly. Then came the voice, deep and unhurried, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to shout to fill a room. "Move along, gentlemen. Make room." Bernard Fairchild stepped out of the pew behind Celia, stood in the center aisle of Dusty Creek Chapel with his hat in one hand, and a look on his face that could have stopped a cattle stampede, and pointed straight at the empty space beside Celia Rourke. "I believe this seat is available," Bernard said, his voice level and loud enough for every person in that chapel to hear it, including Reverend Webb, who had frozen mid-step at the pulpit stairs. "And I intend to sit in it." The silence that followed was the most deafening thing Celia had ever heard in her 26 years on this earth. Bernard Fairchild sat down beside her. He settled into the Rourke family pew with the calm deliberation of a man who had made up his mind about something long ago and was only now letting the world catch up to his decision. He did not look at her right away. He set his hat on his knee, crossed one boot over the other, and fixed his gaze on the pulpit with the patience of a man who could wait out a Texas drought. Celia did not move. She barely breathed. She could feel the warmth radiating off him. She could smell the clean scent of saddle leather and morning air. She could feel the weight of 50 pairs of eyes burning into the side of her face. And deep in the locked and guarded chambers of her heart, something she had kept chained for a very long time pulled hard against its restraints. She did not know it yet, but Bernard Fairchild had just changed everything. It had started 6 weeks before that Sunday morning, on the day Reverend Marcus Webb arrived in Dusty Creek, Texas, on the afternoon stage from San Antonio. Celia had been at the general store when the stage rolled in, purchasing flour and lamp oil, and the small extravagances she allowed herself once a month, which amounted to a paper of sewing needles and a small jar of good honey. She had watched the new preacher climb down from the coach with the particular attention she gave to all newcomers, which was the attention of a woman who had learned the hard way that strangers brought their pasts with them, whether they meant to or not. Marcus Webb was perhaps 40, with a sharp face and silver-threaded hair and the kind of smile that showed all his teeth at once. He wore his collar and coat with precision. He shook hands with Mayor Aldous Trent, who had been standing at the stage stop with the self-important air of a man greeting royalty, and then he let his eyes travel across the main street of Dusty Creek with the slow deliberation of a man taking inventory. His gaze had landed on Celia for just a moment too long. She had not thought much of it then. Men looked at her. She was neither vain nor falsely modest about the fact that she was a woman who drew eyes. It was simply a fact of her life, like the fact that her father's ranch needed constant tending, and the fact that she had been running it alone for 3 years since Thomas Rourke's heart gave out during a branding, leaving her with 200 acres, 40 head of cattle, 2 hands she trusted with her life, and a grief that had become so integrated into her daily routine, she sometimes forgot it was grief and mistook it for just the general weight of living. What she had not known that day at the stage stop was that Marcus Webb already knew her name. She learned that piece of the puzzle on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after his arrival, when she rode into town for the weekly mail and found a letter waiting for her that had been opened and resealed so carelessly the wax was cracked and half peeled. The letter was from her brother Daniel, who had gone east to St. Louis 3 years prior and wrote twice a year with the irregular faithfulness of a man who meant well but was overwhelmed by a growing family and a new life. In the letter, Daniel mentioned, as he always did, the terms of their father's will, which included a specific clause about the Rourke land and the conditions under which it could be transferred. Someone had read that letter. Celia had stood at the mail counter, holding the envelope, feeling the cold finger of warning trace her spine. Postmaster Gibbs had been unusually quick to look away. She had folded the letter, tucked it in her coat, and ridden home with the sick certainty that she was standing at the edge of something she could not yet see the shape of. The Rourke land was the most valuable parcel in the Dusty Creek Valley. Everyone knew it. The south pasture sat above a natural spring that had never once gone dry in living memory. The north field was the finest grazing land in 3 counties. Her father had turned down 3 separate offers from the Aldous-Trent Land Consortium during his lifetime, and Celia had turned down 2 more since his death. Each refusal had made her slightly less popular with a specific and influential subset of Dusty Creek society. What she had not known until a chance overheard conversation between 2 of the mayor's associates at the saloon, which she had been passing on the boardwalk with her hands full of parcels, was that Reverend Marcus Webb had not been called to Dusty Creek by the church committee. He had been brought there by Aldous-Trent. The specific words she heard, spoken through the thin wall of the saloon's side window, were, "Webb will soften her up. A woman alone with no father and no husband, she'll want the approval of the church. And if she doesn't cooperate voluntarily, the land clause in her father's will is the lever we need." Celia had stood very still on the boardwalk for a long moment. Then she had walked home, sat at her kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, and thought about it for a very long time. The clause Daniel's letter referenced was a specific provision in Thomas Rourke's will that stated the land could not be sold or transferred without the witness consent of either a male blood relative or a legal husband, a provision her father had included with the old-fashioned and well-intentioned belief that he was protecting her from being pressured into a bad sale. The provision had teeth. It was legally binding. And in the absence of Daniel, who was 300 miles away and had no immediate plans to return, it represented both her protection and her vulnerability. Because if someone could argue that she had failed to properly maintain the land, or if they could manufacture some legal crisis around her circumstances, the will's language also included a fallback provision that could theoretically place the land in a court-appointed trust. It was the kind of trap that was not built with walls and bars, but with paper and ink and the patient exploitation of a dead man's love for his daughter. Celia had picked up her pen and written to Daniel that same night. She had also, the very next morning, ridden out to the eastern boundary of her land to check the fence line, and found 3 posts pulled and the wire cut clean, as though something or someone had wanted her cattle to drift onto the adjacent parcel. The adjacent parcel belonged to Bernard Fairchild. This was how she had first spoken to him in any meaningful way, though she had known him by sight for years. Bernard Fairchild had come to Dusty Creek in 1874, purchased the old Callaway spread, and rebuilt it into a working cattle operation with the methodical patience of a man who understood that good things required sustained effort. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair and gray eyes that gave him an expression of perpetual careful assessment. He was not unfriendly, but he was not easy. He spoke when he had something to say and was quiet the rest of the time, which in Celia's experience was one of the rarer and more valuable qualities a person could possess. She had ridden to his fence line, examined the cut wire, and then ridden another quarter-mile to the ridge where she could see his south pasture, and found him already there with 2 of his men, looking at 5 of her Hereford cattle grazing peacefully among his longhorns. She had ridden down and he had looked up and she had said, "I am sorry for the trouble, my fence was cut." He had looked at her for a moment in that careful way of his. Then he had looked at the wire his own man was holding up, which had been gathered from the post holes. "That wire wasn't pulled by cattle," he had said. "No," she had agreed. "It was not." They had looked at each other across the short distance between their horses, and something had passed between them that Celia had filed away carefully without examining it too closely, because she had far too many other things pressing on her attention to add the complications of Bernard Fairchild to the list. He had helped her men drive her cattle back to her side of the line. He had said before she turned to leave, "Miss Rourke, if you have any more trouble with that fence, I would appreciate knowing about it." She had said she would, and she had ridden away with a feeling she could not quite name, a feeling that was not quite relief and not quite something else but sat somewhere between the two. That had been 2 weeks before the Sunday that changed everything. In those 2 weeks, Celia had attended the new Reverend's first Sunday service and found him to be a polished and effective speaker, who nonetheless left her with the unshakable feeling of watching a performance. She had received 3 separate visits from church committee members who had, with increasing tactlessness, suggested that a woman in her position might benefit from guidance and community support. She had found another section of her fence damaged, this time on the western side. She had received a formal letter from Mayor Trent's office citing a municipal inquiry into water rights along the Spring Creek boundary, which her father's lawyer, old Henry Marsh, who was mostly retired but still sharp, had helped her understand was technically possible but practically baseless. And she had ridden past Bernard Fairchild's ranch twice on errands and found herself, both times, looking toward his gate with a conflicted feeling she was becoming less successful at ignoring. The Saturday before the Sunday in question, she had been at the creek checking the water level when she heard hooves on the bank behind her and turned to find Bernard himself riding along the shared fence line that ran parallel to the creek. He had stopped when he saw her. "Miss Rourke," he had said. "Mr. Fairchild," she had said. They had stood there for a moment with the creek running between them and the late afternoon light turning the water copper and gold. "I heard about the water rights inquiry," he said. He did not dress it up or pretend he had come across the information accidentally. "Trent's office sent a preliminary notice to all landholders in the valley, mine included." "He's not after your water," Celia said. "No," Bernard agreed. "He's not. But I am on record as a neighboring landholder, which means I have standing in any inquiry that touches the spring." He paused. "I want you to know that I intend to file a counterstatement of support for the existing water rights boundaries." Celia had looked at him for a long moment. The creek ran. A mockingbird called from the cottonwood above them. "Why?" she asked. It was not a suspicious question. It was a genuine one. She had learned in the years of running her ranch alone to ask why when she did not understand a person's motivation, because assumptions had cost her before. Bernard looked at the water for a moment, then back at her. "Because what Trent is doing is wrong," he said. "And because your father was a good man who dealt fairly with me when I was establishing my operation, and I don't forget that." There was more in his expression than those 2 reasons, but he did not say the rest, and Celia did not press him, and they rode back to their respective properties in the golden evening light with an understanding between them that was not yet defined but was clearly something. That night she had not slept well. She had lain awake listening to the wind move through the grass outside her window and tried very hard not to think about gray eyes and a voice that carried without needing to raise itself. The next morning was Sunday. And that was the morning that Reverend Marcus Webb walked straight past her pew, in full view of the entire congregation of Dusty Creek Chapel, with a cold deliberateness that made the intended message unmistakably clear. You are not in good standing here. You are isolated. You are alone. And Bernard Fairchild stood up, scraped his pew across the floor like a declaration of war, and sat down beside her. The service that followed was one of the longest hours of Celia's life, and also, if she was being completely honest with herself in the quiet privacy of her own thoughts, one of the most unexpectedly warm. Bernard sat beside her with the calm solidity of a stone wall, which was not a romantic description except that stone walls kept out cold winds, and she had been very cold for a very long time. He did not speak. He did not fidget. He did not look at her with the sideways curiosity that everyone else in that chapel was directing at them both. He simply sat and listened to the sermon with an expression of polite attentiveness that gave nothing away, and when the congregation rose to sing, he rose and sang in a quiet but accurate baritone that surprised her. Reverend Webb's sermon was about the virtue of community and the dangers of pride. Celia noted the barely concealed direction of it with a detached recognition that would have impressed her father, who had always said she had a lawyer's mind and a cowhand's stubbornness in equal and useful measure. When the service ended and they filed out into the bright Texas morning, the whispers followed them like a second congregation. Celia held her head straight and her chin level and walked to the chapel door, where she shook the reverend's hand because to refuse it would have been to show a wound she was not going to show. Webb held her hand a beat too long. His smile was fixed and particular. "Miss Rourke," he said, "I hope the sermon gave you comfort." "It gave me a great deal to think about," she said evenly. Then Bernard's hand was briefly at the small of her back, a light and perfectly appropriate pressure that lasted exactly as long as it needed to last to move her out of the doorway and into the sunlight, and she heard him say behind her in that carrying quiet voice, "Reverend, fine morning." On the chapel steps, in front of at least 30 people, Mrs. Ida Hargrove, who was the closest thing Dusty Creek had to a social authority, planted herself directly in their path. "Bernard Fairchild," Ida said, in a tone that suggested she was either amused or scandalized and had not yet decided which. "You caused quite a stir in there." "Did I?" Bernard said. "You know very well you did." Ida's eyes moved between them with the shrewd brightness of a woman who had outlived 3 husbands and understood human nature at a cellular level. Then she looked at Celia. "My dear, you are invited to supper on Tuesday. I will not take no for an answer." Celia understood that this was Ida's version of a declaration of alliance, delivered publicly and unmistakably. She accepted it with genuine gratitude. When they descended the steps into the dusty churchyard, and the crowd began to dissolve into Sunday morning errands and visiting, Bernard fell into step beside her as she walked toward her horse. "Thank you," she said without looking at him. The words came out more quietly than she intended. He was quiet for a few steps. Then he said, "I'm not a man who does things for thanks." She glanced at him sidelong. "Then what do you do things for?" He looked at her directly with that gray-eyed steadiness. "Because they're right," he said, "and because sometimes a person needs someone to stand with them, and the right response to that is to stand." She held his gaze for a moment longer than she had planned. Then she said, "I have a fence post down on the south line again. I found it this morning before church." Something shifted in his expression very slightly. "Which section?" "Near the cottonwood stand, 3rd post from the creek marker." "I'll ride out this afternoon and look at it with you if you're willing," he said. "I want to see the pattern. 3 cuts in the same property in 3 weeks is not coincidence." They stood beside her horse, and the Texas sun beat down on the churchyard, and half the congregation was watching them from the corner of their eyes while pretending not to, and Celia felt something she had not felt in a long time, the particular and precarious sensation of not being entirely alone. 3 o'clock, she said. "I'll meet you at the creek marker." He nodded once and walked to his own horse, and she did not watch him go, but she was aware of the exact moment he mounted and rode out of the churchyard because the particular quality of her awareness of him was already that specific and that involuntary. She rode home through the late morning warmth, and for the first time in weeks, the weight on her chest felt fractionally lighter. Henry Marsh was waiting at her gate. The old lawyer was seated on the top rail of her fence with the comfort of a man who had been sitting on fence rails since before she was born, his ancient hat pushed back and a folded paper in his hand. He was past 70 now, but his eyes were as sharp as ever, and those eyes were worried. "Celia," he said, "I need you to read this." She dismounted, tied her horse, and took the paper. It was a formal legal notice from the county court in San Antonio, filed 3 days prior. It cited the provisions of Thomas Rourke's will, made reference to the absence of the required male relative or spouse, and initiated a formal review of the land's administrative status under the contested provisions. Her stomach went cold and tight. "How did they get this filed so quickly?" she asked. "They've been preparing it for months," Henry said, his voice carrying a quiet anger that she found oddly strengthening. "This Webb's arrival, the fence trouble, the water rights inquiry, it was all groundwork. They wanted you feeling isolated and uncertain before they made the formal move." She read it through twice, very carefully, the way her father had taught her to read legal documents, once for what it said and once for what it was trying to do. "Can they win this?" she asked. Henry was quiet for a moment. "Not easily, but the provision is real, and with the right judge and enough political pressure, they could drag it out long enough to cost you dearly. Time and legal fees alone could put you in a weakened position." She folded the paper precisely. "What are my options? Produce Daniel," he said, "which takes time you may not have, or challenge the provision directly as an inequitable restriction, which is a strong argument but requires a sympathetic court." He paused. "Or the provision becomes moot if you were to marry." She looked at him steadily. "Henry," he held up both hands, "I am not suggesting anything. I am telling you what the law says." She took the notice inside, placed it on her desk beside her father's Bible, and stood in her kitchen with her hands on the edge of the counter, and breathed slowly and deliberately until the cold panic settled into something more useful. Then she changed out of her Sunday dress, put on her riding clothes, and began preparing to meet Bernard Fairchild at 3 o'clock. He was already at the creek marker when she arrived, crouching beside the pulled fence post with a focus that suggested he had been there for a while and had already been thinking hard about what he was seeing. He looked up when she dismounted. He read something in her expression immediately. "What happened?" he said. She told him about the court notice. She told him plainly and completely without softening it, because she had already decided that if Bernard Fairchild was going to stand beside her in the chapel in front of the entire town, she owed him the honest shape of what he was standing beside. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, still crouching, looking at the fence post he was holding. Then he set the post down and stood up. "This is Trent's work," he said. "Not just the court notice, all of it. The fence cuts, the water inquiry, the notice. He imported a preacher to socially isolate you, cut your fences to suggest you can't manage the property, filed the water rights complaint to cloud the title, and now this to formalize the pressure." He said it with a careful precision that confirmed he had been thinking about this longer and harder than this afternoon. "When did you start putting this together?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "When I saw the cut wire on your fence 3 weeks ago. I recognized the pattern from a land dispute I witnessed in East Texas in 1873. Different players, same method." She felt the pieces of something click into place, something that had to do not with her legal troubles but with the man standing in front of her and why he had filed that counterstatement and why he had sat down beside her in church and why she kept riding past his gate. "You were protecting me," she said. "It was not an accusation. It was an understanding. I was being a neighbor," he said. Then, after a pause, "I was also being something more than that, and I think you know it." The creek ran beside them. The cottonwoods stirred in the warm afternoon wind. "Bernard," she said. "Celia," he said. They looked at each other across 2 feet of Texas air, and the thing that had been building between them for weeks was suddenly impossible to pretend, was simply neighborly concern. "I received a legal notice this morning," she said. "That tells me I am essentially trapped unless I can solve an impossible equation. And you are looking at me with an expression that suggests you are about to say something that may complicate things further." "I'm not going to say anything you're not expecting," he said. "And I'm not going to pretend this is simpler than it is. But I want you to know that whatever you decide about your situation, I intend to help you, and that offer has nothing attached to it." She appreciated that enormously. "And what about the thing that you're also feeling, which we are both carefully not discussing?" A brief expression crossed his face that she thought might be the closest he came to smiling in a genuinely unguarded way. "That's a separate matter, and it can wait until you're not in the middle of a legal crisis if that's what you prefer." "It cannot wait indefinitely," she said, surprising herself. He looked at her carefully. "No," he agreed. "It probably cannot." They fixed the fence post together. It was not a romantic activity in any conventional sense, but there was something in the working side by side, in the easy coordination of two people who were both practical and capable, that felt like its own kind of intimacy. He held the post while she tamped the soil. She held the wire while he fastened the staples with the flat-faced hammer from his saddlebag. They worked without excessive direction and without getting in each other's way, which was more revealing than either of them commented on. When they were done, they stood in the late afternoon light with grass-stained knees and dirty hands, and Bernard said, "I want to ride the whole fence line, not just this section. I want to map every point that's been touched." "Today?" she asked. "If you're willing." They rode her fence line until the sun was low and the shadows were long, and Bernard made notes in a small leather-covered book with a stub of pencil, marking each disturbed section with a number and a brief description. He explained, as they rode, that the pattern of cuts suggested someone who knew the land well, who was targeting the sections closest to the spring and to the property boundary markers, which pointed toward an attempt to establish ambiguity about the property lines themselves. "If they can argue the fence has shifted," he said, "they can argue the boundary markers are uncertain, and uncertain boundaries create room to dispute the spring's ownership." "That's very thorough for a cattle rancher," Celia said. "I spent 2 years reading law before I decided the outdoors agreed with me better than a law office," he said. She looked at him. "You studied law." "I didn't finish," he said. "But I remember enough to recognize a legal strategy when I see one assembled in front of me." She thought about Henry Marsh, about the court notice, about the options available to her. She thought about what it would mean to involve Bernard Fairchild more deeply in this fight. She thought about what it would mean to involve him in any other sense. She was not a woman who made decisions quickly or carelessly. She had been running a ranch alone for 3 years through drought and grief, and the particular exhaustion of being solely responsible for every choice, and she had learned that quick decisions made in moments of vulnerability were the ones most likely to betray her. But she had also learned to recognize when something in front of her was real. They rode back to her gate as the evening star appeared, and Bernard said, "I'd like to speak with Henry Marsh tomorrow, if you'll allow it. There may be a legal argument I can help him build around the fence tampering itself, establishing malicious interference with the property that could be used to challenge the standing of the court notice." "I'll send word to Henry tonight," she said. He prepared to mount, then stopped and looked back at her with his horse's reins in his hand. "Celia," he said, "for what it's worth, you are not alone in this." She felt those words settle into the space behind her ribs where the loneliness lived. "I know," she said, "thank you." He rode out, and the evening settled around her, and she stood at her gate in the warm dark and allowed herself, very carefully, to feel the beginnings of something that frightened her in the best possible way. The next week was a collision of crises and revelations that moved too fast for careful distance to be maintained. Henry Marsh and Bernard met on Monday morning in Henry's small office above the dry goods store, and Celia sat in the corner chair and listened to two careful and intelligent men work out the shape of a legal defense, with the focused energy of men who understood what was at stake. Bernard's knowledge of land law was rusty in places but solid in its foundations, and his methodical documentation of the fence tampering provided Henry with a counterargument that could reframe the entire court proceeding. "We file a complaint of malicious interference," Henry said, leaning back in his chair, "establishing a documented pattern of deliberate property sabotage intended to manufacture the very conditions being cited in the court notice. We tie Webb to Trent through the circumstances of his arrival, and we establish that the isolation strategy and the property challenges were coordinated." "Can we prove the connection?" Celia asked. "We can establish enough circumstantial weight to make a judge very uncomfortable about proceeding," Bernard said, "which is often sufficient." "We also need Daniel," Henry said, looking at Celia. "His testimony, even by written declaration, would significantly strengthen the position under the will's provisions." "I wrote him 3 weeks ago," Celia said. "He should have received it by now." "Write again," Henry said. "More urgently, explain the specific legal situation." She wrote to Daniel that afternoon, a letter that did not minimize the urgency and that included a copy of the court notice. She had it on the Tuesday eastbound stage. On Wednesday, Reverend Webb came to call at her ranch. She was in the yard splitting kindling when the buggy came up her drive, and she set the axe aside and watched him approach with the calm, alert attention of a woman who had been expecting exactly this kind of visit. Webb descended from the buggy with his hat in hand, and his most pastoral expression arranged carefully on his face. He spoke to her about community, about the church's desire to support her in her challenges, about how he had heard about the legal difficulties and wanted her to know that the congregation stood ready to help. His words were impeccably warm and entirely hollow, and behind them she could see the architecture of the trap he was helping to build. "I appreciate the concern, Reverend," she said in her most even and unrevealing voice. "I have capable legal counsel and I am confident in my position." His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Of course," he said, "though sometimes legal matters are only part of the picture. A woman in your situation, maintaining a large property alone, it might give some people cause for concern about the capacity to manage such a significant holding." There it was, the velvet-covered threat. "I have managed this property profitably and without complaint from any legitimate party for 3 years," she said. "I am comfortable with my capacity." He smiled his full-toothed smile. "I'm sure you are, my dear. I'm sure you are." After he left, she sat on her porch steps and worked through a cold, detailed anger that was actually quite clarifying. She was done being strategically patient. She was done waiting for the trap to fully reveal itself before responding. She saddled her horse and rode to Bernard's ranch. He was in the breaking corral with a young roan gelding when she arrived, and he handed the horse to his stable hand and came to the fence when he saw her expression. She told him about Webb's visit, every word, including the particular implication about her capacity. Bernard's expression did not change dramatically, but there was something in his eyes that had gone very still and very decided. "He's escalating," Bernard said, "which means they're feeling the pressure of the counter-strategy. Uncomfortable people make mistakes." "I want to be proactive," Celia said, "not just defensive. I want to bring this forward before they make their next move." He leaned on the top rail of the fence and looked at her with a consideration that was deeply focused. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking," she said carefully, "that Trent and Webb are operating on the assumption that I am socially and legally isolated. The court notice, the church strategy, all of it depends on that assumption. If we can publicly and demonstrably break that isolation in a way that is both socially and legally significant, we remove their primary lever." Bernard was very still. "You're talking about the will provision," he said. "I am telling you what I'm thinking," she said. "I am not asking for anything." "Celia," his voice was very quiet. "Look at me." She looked at him. "I have been thinking about that provision since the moment I read the copy of the notice you showed me," he said. "And I want to be very clear about something. Whatever I am about to say to you has nothing to do with legal strategy, and everything to do with the fact that I have been looking at you across fence lines and creek beds and church pews for longer than is strictly explainable by neighborly concern. Her heart was doing something inconvenient and entirely involuntary. Say it plainly, she told him. I want to court you properly, he said. I want to do it the right way, at the right pace, and I want it to be entirely separate from the business with Trent and Webb. But I am not going to pretend I haven't been thinking about the intersection of those two things, because you are the most honest person I have spoken to in years, and you deserve honesty back. She was quiet for a moment. The corral horses moved in the background. Somewhere on the property, a man was hammering something. I believe you, she said, and I believe there is an honest path between what I'm facing and what I would like, if you are willing to walk it carefully. Carefully is something I'm good at, he said. She almost smiled. I've noticed. He looked at her with something warm and serious and very direct. Let me speak to Henry, he said. And let me take you to supper on Saturday, at the hotel dining room, publicly and without ambiguity. That will cause talk, she said. Good, he said simply. She rode home in the late afternoon with a warmth in her chest that she no longer tried to explain away. Saturday's supper at the Dusty Creek Hotel dining room was, by every account, the social event of that particular week. Celia wore her good blue dress, which had been her mother's favorite color, and pinned her hair with the silver combs that had been a birthday gift from her father 5 years ago. She arrived at the hotel at exactly 6 o'clock and found Bernard already in the lobby, wearing a dark coat and a clean white shirt, and the way he looked at her when she came through the door was something she filed away with the careful attention of a woman who was allowing herself to want something for the first time in a long time. He offered his arm. She took it. They sat at the best table in the dining room and ate roasted chicken and fresh bread, and talked for 3 hours with the ease of two people who had been talking honestly for weeks, and were finding that the more they said, the more there was to say. He told her about growing up in Virginia, about the law school years, about the East Texas land dispute he had witnessed, and the disillusionment with the legal establishment that had sent him west looking for work he could do with his hands. She told him about growing up on the Rourke ranch, about her mother dying when she was 12, about learning to ride and brand and manage accounts before most girls her age were through with school. She told him about her father and the grief of losing him, and the way she had thrown herself into the work, because grief without purpose was just pain. He listened to all of it with the full and undivided attention of a person who understood that being truly heard was a rare and valuable thing. You are remarkable, he said at one point, not as a flattery but as a statement of observed fact, which made it considerably more effective. I'm practical, she said. Those are not mutually exclusive, he said. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of the hotel dining room, with the sounds of the town drifting through the windows, and she felt something she had almost forgotten existed, the particular and dangerous warmth of trusting someone. When he walked her to her horse afterward in the soft June dark, he held her hand for a moment at the end, just held it, with a quiet deliberateness that said everything that was not yet ready to be said in words. Tuesday, he said. Supper at Ida Hargrove's. I've been invited as well. She raised an eyebrow. Ida moves fast. Ida has been watching this town for 50 years and knows what she thinks about things, he said. I respect that. She rode home in the dark and did not sleep for a satisfying length of time, and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. The legal situation moved quickly in the following days. Bernard and Henry filed the malicious interference complaint on Monday morning, and the documentation Bernard had assembled from the fence survey was, by Henry's professional assessment, impressively thorough. The complaint named Aldous Trent specifically, and cited the circumstantial connections to the Reverend's arrival and activities. The response from Trent's side came Tuesday afternoon in the form of 3 of the mayor's men riding past her property line at a distance that was technically legal but unmistakably menacing, Bernard arrived at her gate an hour later, having apparently been watching her road from his northern ridge. "I saw them," he said. "I know," she said. "So did my hands." She had two ranch hands, Pete Garrow and Miguel Vasquez, both of whom had been with her since her father's time and were entirely reliable, and had been watching the riders with the focused attention of men who understood the situation. "This is intimidation," Bernard said. "Documented. It adds to the complaint." She noted it in writing that evening and sent the note to Henry. The situation might have continued to escalate in that direction had Daniel's reply not arrived on Thursday, 17 days after she had sent her first letter, which meant he had written back almost immediately upon receiving it. Daniel Rourke's letter was 3 pages long and characteristically direct. He was furious about the court notice. He had spoken to a lawyer in St. Louis. He was already planning to come to Dusty Creek, and his estimated arrival was within the following 2 weeks by the fastest route available. Celia sat at her kitchen table with the letter in her hands and felt, very distinctly, the balance of the situation shift. She rode to Bernard's. He read the letter and then looked up at her with the first expression she had seen on his face that could be described without qualification as relief. "This changes the calculation significantly," he said. "With Daniel here, the will provision is covered by legitimate means, and the court notice loses its central premise." "Trent will know that too," she said. "He may try to move faster." "Then we move faster first," Bernard said. "Henry can request a court date for the malicious interference complaint. Getting that on the docket forces their hand." They were standing in his kitchen, she realized, with the afternoon light coming through the window and his coffee cups on the table, and it was somehow the most natural thing in the world. She had been in his kitchen before, briefly, but this time felt different, felt like a place she was not visiting but existing in, and she was aware of that distinction in a way that was simultaneously terrifying and entirely correct. He was looking at her with that gray-eyed steadiness, and she thought about what he had said at the fence, about wanting to do things the right way, and about what she had said to Henry, that the provision would become moot if she were to marry, and about how both of those things were facts that did not require her to rush anything but did require her to be honest with herself about what she wanted. "Bernard," she said. "Celia," he said. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I have spent 3 years being the only person responsible for every single decision on this land and in my life. I do not know how to share that easily. I may be difficult. I spent 2 years in a law office and 8 years alone on a ranch," he said. "I am not looking for easy, I am looking for real." "I am very real," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the point." They looked at each other in his kitchen with the Texas afternoon burning outside the window, and he crossed the small distance between them and took both her hands in his, which were large and calloused and very warm, and she did not step back. "I am not going to rush you," he said. "I am also not going to pretend I don't know what I want. I want the chance to earn your trust completely, to learn what you need and be that, to stand beside you in churches and legal offices and fence lines for as long as you'll have me. I want to court you properly and then, when you're ready and not before, ask you the question I've been thinking about since the first time I watched you hold a fence wire in a muddy field and look at me like you expected the world to make sense." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You may ask the question sooner than you think." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, something that was warm and careful and very certain. "Good," he said quietly. He did not ask it that day, and she did not press it, because they both understood that there was a right way to do things, and they were in the middle of a legal crisis, and some things deserved better timing than that. But the understanding between them was now so clear and so complete that it had the solidity of something already decided, which in a practical sense it was. Supper at Ida Hargrove's that evening was warm and wonderful in the way that Ida's hospitality always was, abundant and genuine, and laced with the sharp observations of a woman who missed nothing. Ida had also invited Henry Marsh and his wife, and a young schoolteacher named Ruth Carver who was new to the town and had befriended Celia at the spring social. And it was the kind of gathering that reminded Celia how much she had missed having people around her. Ida watched Bernard watch Celia with the bright satisfaction of a woman, observing the natural conclusion of something she had already understood from the beginning. At one point, when the men were on the porch and Celia was helping Ida carry dishes, Ida said, very quietly, "That man has been in love with you since before you noticed him." Celia set down the plates carefully. "Ida." "I'm old and I've buried 3 husbands," Ida said. "I know what I'm looking at. Don't waste time being cautious when the right thing is standing right in front of you." "I'm not wasting it," Celia said. Ida looked at her sharply and then smiled with great satisfaction. "Good girl," she said. The following Thursday, Aldous Trent made what turned out to be his critical mistake. He had clearly grown impatient with the pace of his own strategy, made anxious by the malicious interference filing and the rumored news of Daniel's impending arrival, and in his impatience he overreached. He sent 2 men to the ranch with a formal offer to purchase the property, delivered not to Henry Marsh but directly to Celia, at her gate, with an implied suggestion that the offer came with an implicit understanding that the legal complications surrounding the property would resolve themselves if the offer were accepted. It was, in the language of the legal complaint Henry was already building, an explicit quid pro quo. Pete Garrow witnessed it. Miguel Vasquez witnessed it. And by pure coincidence, Bernard had ridden over to discuss the schedule of the upcoming fence repair, and was standing 20 feet away at the corral gate when the exchange occurred. Celia refused the offer calmly and completely, asked the men to leave her property, and watched them go with the satisfaction of a woman who had just watched an overreaching opponent hand her exactly the evidence she needed. The moment they were out of the gate, she turned to Bernard. "Did you hear all of that?" she asked. "Every word," he said. His expression was the most directly angry she had seen it, though it was contained in the way his anger always seemed to be, compressed into a very deliberate stillness. "Henry needs to know about this today." "I'll ride to town now," she said. "I'm coming with you," he said. Henry Marsh, upon hearing the account and collecting signed witness statements from Pete and Miguel that afternoon, described the development with undisguised professional satisfaction as the single most useful thing Aldous Trent had ever done for Celia Rourke. "He's given us a coercion argument," Henry said. "This is no longer just a land dispute. This is documented attempted coercion in connection with a pending legal proceeding. That changes the nature of what we can file." Bernard had been right. Uncomfortable people made mistakes. They filed the additional complaint that same afternoon. The court date for the malicious interference claim was set for 3 weeks hence. The coercion evidence was attached. On the ride back from town in the late afternoon light, Bernard pulled his horse alongside hers at the edge of town and said, "I think the worst of it is nearly past." She thought about that. "The legal worst, perhaps." "Yes," he agreed, "the other kind was never really bad." She looked at him with the sun in her eyes. "Bernard, are you flirting with me?" He looked at her with that almost smile. "I'm courting you. There's a distinction." She laughed. It came out genuine and warm and surprised her slightly, the ease of it, and she realized she had been laughing more in the past weeks than she had in the past 2 years. He looked at her with open warmth when she laughed, unhidden and entirely sincere, and she thought that a man who looked at a woman that way when she laughed was a man who was genuinely delighted by her, which was, she reflected, rather more valuable than many other things people spent time pursuing. Daniel Rourke arrived on a Saturday afternoon on the weekly stage from San Antonio, having traveled from St. Louis by train to Dallas and then overland, looking dusty and tired, and absolutely furious about the situation his sister was in. He was 3 years older than Celia, built like their father, with the same auburn-brown hair and the same stubborn jaw, and he embraced her at the stage stop with the force of a man who had been 300 miles away from a problem he felt responsible for. She introduced him to Bernard on the way to her ranch, and she watched her brother look at Bernard with the assessing attention of a man who understood immediately what he was looking at. Daniel shook Bernard's hand. "You've been looking out for her." "I've been her neighbor," Bernard said. Daniel looked at him for a moment. "Right," he said. That evening, the three of them sat at Celia's kitchen table with the legal documents spread between them, and Daniel listened to the full account of the past weeks with the growing anger of a man who understood that his absence had been a structural weakness that someone had deliberately exploited. "The will provision," he said, when Celia reached that part. "Father meant it to protect you. He'd be horrified. He didn't know it would be used this way," Celia said. "He couldn't have anticipated Trent specifically." Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents. Then he looked up at Bernard. "You too. Where does that stand?" Bernard looked at him steadily and said, "I intend to ask your sister a question that I'd like your awareness of when the time is right." Daniel looked at Celia. "And where do you stand?" "I stand beside him," she said simply. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, with the look of a man who had arrived expecting to solve a problem and was discovering that his sister had already handled it herself, which was, Celia could see, simultaneously a relief and a slightly humbling discovery. "All right," he said. Then to Bernard, "You'd better mean what you say." "I always do," Bernard said. The court proceeding for the malicious interference and coercion claims was a brisk affair by the standards of the Dusty Creek Circuit Court, which met on the second Tuesday of every month in the courthouse that also served as the town meeting hall, and when necessary, the location of public auctions. Daniel was present, which immediately rendered the will provision argument moot and reduced Trent's leverage by a significant margin. Henry had prepared documentation that was thorough and well organized, and presented with the quiet authority of a man who had been practicing law in this county for 35 years and knew how to make a judge uncomfortable with the precise and economical application of evidence. Bernard sat in the gallery behind Celia and Daniel, and she was aware of his steady presence the way she had become aware of it in the chapel weeks ago, as a particular quality of warmth and certainty at her back. Aldous Trent appeared with his own lawyer and the expression of a man who had not expected the situation to develop this way. Reverend Webb was notably absent. The judge, a practical and unsentimental man named Horace Clement, reviewed the filed documents with the focused attention of someone who did not enjoy having his time wasted. He asked several pointed questions of Trent's lawyer that suggested he had read the malicious interference filing with considerable care. He received Daniel Rourke's declaration regarding the will provisions and made a note. When he issued his preliminary ruling, it was clear and comprehensive. The court notice regarding the Rourke property's administrative status was dismissed based on the satisfactory compliance with the will's provisions. The malicious interference complaint was advanced to a full hearing, with Trent formally named as a respondent. The coercion evidence was noted as a matter for the county attorney's attention. It was not a complete resolution. The full hearing would be months away. But it was a decisive turning of the tide, and everyone in that courtroom understood it. As they filed out, Trent passed close to Celia in the narrow doorway, and his expression was the expression of a man recalculating his position with the grim focus of someone who had not yet accepted the full consequences of his choices. He said nothing. Henry Marsh squeezed her hand as they reached the street. "Your father," he said, "would have been very proud." She had to stop and look away for a moment at that. Bernard materialized at her side and said nothing, simply stood there, which was exactly what she needed. After the legal proceedings, the days settled into something that had the character not of victory so much as breathing room, which was equally precious. The fence cutting stopped. The water rights inquiry was quietly withdrawn. Reverend Marcus Webb resigned his position at the end of June, citing personal reasons, and was gone on the northbound stage within a week of his resignation, taking Trent's principal weapon with him and confirming, in the minds of everyone who had watched the past weeks unfold, exactly what his purpose in Dusty Creek had been. Trent himself became notably quieter. His land consortium made no further moves on the Rourke property. The full hearing on the malicious interference claim was scheduled, but everyone understood it was a matter that would likely settle before reaching that point, and that understanding had its own value. Daniel stayed for 3 weeks, which was longer than he had planned, partly to assist with the legal formalities and partly, Celia suspected, because he was finding Dusty Creek more interesting than he had expected. He helped with the ranch work alongside Pete and Miguel, and rebuilt his connection with his sister over long evenings on the porch and early morning rides along the fence lines that had given them both so much trouble. On his last evening before his departure, Daniel sat with Celia on the porch steps in the warm July dark, and he said, "He's a good man." "I know," she said. "When he asks," Daniel said, "I want you to say yes." She looked at the stars for a moment. "I had already decided to." Daniel let out a breath. "Good, because he asked me this morning." She turned to look at her brother. He was smiling with the full and unguarded warmth that she had not seen on his face since before their father died. "He came to me at breakfast," Daniel said, "and asked me formally, as your closest male relative, for my blessing to propose to you. He said he wanted to do it correctly. He said he had been waiting until the legal situation was resolved, so that you would know without any possible doubt that his proposal had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with you." Celia was quiet for a very long moment. "He is," she said finally, her voice slightly uneven, "the most infuriatingly thoughtful man I have ever encountered." Daniel laughed. "You love him." She pressed her fingertips against her eyes briefly. "Completely," she said. "Yes." Bernard came to her gate the following evening, the evening after Daniel's departure, and he was wearing his good coat and carrying a small bundle of Texas bluebonnets, which he had clearly picked himself from the meadow near the creek, and his expression was the most openly uncertain she had ever seen it, which was somehow the most endearing thing about him. She was waiting on her porch. She had known he was coming because Daniel had told her, and she had been in a state of radiant, terrified, absolute certainty all day that had made Pete and Miguel exchange significant glances and stay very busy in the far corners of the ranch. He came through the gate and up the path with the bluebonnets in one hand and his hat in the other. She came down off the porch steps to meet him. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her with everything he felt completely visible in his face for the first time, unguarded and deliberate and very, very certain. "Celia Rourke," he said. "I have been looking for a reason to say this to you properly since the day I watched you fix a fence post in a muddy field and look at the world like it owed you an honest answer." He paused. "I love you. I have been in love with you for longer than is entirely respectable, and I would very much like, if you will have me, to spend the rest of my life being your partner in everything, fence lines and legal hearings and all the ordinary and extraordinary things in between." He held out the bluebonnets. She took them. She looked at them for a moment, these wildflowers he had picked himself from the meadow by the creek. "Bernard," she said, "I love you back. I have been trying not to for weeks, which was a terrible waste of effort, and I would be very glad to stop trying." He looked at her with that open warmth she had been cataloging since the day she first saw it, and then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple, honest gold band with a single small sapphire that caught the evening light with a blue as clear as a Texas sky. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "I have been carrying it since before I left Virginia, because she gave it to me and said I'd know when the time was right." She extended her left hand. He put the ring on her finger with a steadiness that spoke of absolute certainty, and then he held her hand for a moment with both of his. She looked at the ring and then at him. "Yes," she said, which was technically the answer to a question he had already asked, and they both understood it perfectly. He smiled then, fully and genuinely, the first time she had seen him smile without any reservation at all, and it changed his entire face in a way that filled her chest with so much warmth she thought she might simply overflow with it. He kissed her. It was the kind of kiss that settled into the bones, the kind that did not hurry and did not need to, warm and certain and entirely itself. And she kissed him back with the conviction of a woman who had decided and meant it. Behind them, from the direction of the corral, there was an extremely unconvincing cough that could only have been Pete Garrow, and then the sound of footsteps retreating at speed, and she broke the kiss laughing, which made Bernard laugh too, quietly and warmly and with his forehead against hers. "They knew," she said. "Everyone knows," he said. "I believe Ida Hargrove told the entire town last week." She laughed again. "Of course she did." They stood in the gold evening light in front of her father's house on her grandfather's land, and the creek ran in the distance, and the bluebonnets were in her hand, and the ring was on her finger, and the world felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a place that had space in it for joy. They were married on the first Saturday of August, 1878, in Dusty Creek Chapel by the Reverend sent from San Antonio to fill the vacancy left by Marcus Webb's hasty departure. The new reverend was a gentle, elderly man named Pastor John Fairweather, who shook hands like he meant it, and whose sermons were plain and warm, and entirely without hidden agendas, which made him immediately beloved by the congregation. Ida Hargrove occupied her usual pew with such an expression of proprietary satisfaction that Henry Marsh said afterward it was as though she had personally arranged the entire thing, which in several meaningful respects she possibly had. Pete and Miguel sat in the front row, which was the first time either of them had been in the front row of any church in their lives, and wore their best shirts with the focused discomfort of men determined to honor the occasion correctly. Daniel Rourke, who had been contacted by express letter, and had made the return journey from St. Louis with what he described as undignified haste, stood beside Celia and gave her away with a solemnity that lasted precisely until he caught her eye at the altar, at which point they both had to breathe very carefully for a moment. Celia wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit, ivory silk with simple embroidery at the collar, and she carried a small bouquet of Texas bluebonnets because they were the right flowers, and she had never needed anyone to explain what they meant. Bernard stood at the altar in his best coat with his dark hair brushed, and his gray eyes absolutely steady on her as she came down the aisle, and the expression on his face was the one she had been memorizing in small, careful increments for months, open and warm and entirely certain, only now he was not keeping any part of it in reserve. They spoke their vows in the clear voices of people who meant what they were saying, and when Pastor Fairweather pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted in an enthusiasm that somewhat exceeded the usual Sunday morning decorum, but that the pastor received with the wide smile of a man who loved his work. The celebration at Ida Hargrove's house afterward was abundant and warm, and went until well past 10 o'clock in the Texas evening, by which point the stars were brilliant overhead, and the fiddle player Ida had hired had moved through every reel and waltz in his considerable repertoire at least twice. Bernard danced with her on Ida's porch under the stars, which he did with considerably more grace than she had expected, and which she told him so, to which he said that growing up in Virginia had certain compensating features for the other inconveniences of that upbringing. Daniel, who was departing again in 3 days with the somewhat abashed admission that his wife in St. Louis had been extraordinarily patient about all of this, watched them dance with an expression of uncomplicated happiness that Celia stored in her heart with great care. She and Bernard rode back to the ranch together in the warm August dark, and the land lay around them in the starlight with the particular beauty that belonged to things that were yours in the deepest sense, earned and loved and known. They stood at the gate for a moment before going in. "This is your home," she said to him. "As much as mine, I want you to know that." He took her hand. "Ours," he said. "Ours," she agreed. They went inside. The summer folded into fall with the particular beauty of the Texas seasons, which were not dramatic like the seasons Bernard had known in Virginia, but had their own quiet magnificence in the way the light changed, and the grass turned, and the mornings grew crisp and clear. They worked the ranch together, which was not always easy because they were both people with opinions and particular ways of doing things, and the early weeks of combining their operations, which they decided formally to run as a single entity under a practical business arrangement, Henry Marsh drew up, required the kind of negotiation that two strong-minded people inevitably encounter when they are learning to be a we instead of two separate I's. They had disagreements. They had one substantial argument in October about the decision to purchase additional cattle before the winter, which involved both of them being very direct and somewhat loud in the kitchen, until they had thoroughly argued it from every angle and arrived at a compromise that was actually better than either of their original positions, after which they sat down to supper and were perfectly fine, which was the pattern of how they handled things and which suited them both. They also had evenings on the porch watching the sunset over the pasture, and mornings at the kitchen table with coffee and the ledgers, and rides along the fence lines that had become, somehow, their place, the place where they had first understood what was between them, and where they returned when something needed to be talked through with the particular honesty that open air seemed to make easier. Bernard had a dry humor that emerged in small, precise observations about the world that made her laugh at unexpected moments. She had a capacity for focused work that he admired openly and without patronizing qualifications. He was methodical in his planning. She was decisive in her execution. Between them, the combined ranch operation ran with an efficiency that Pete and Miguel observed with professional satisfaction and a reasonable degree of personal pride. The malicious interference hearing occurred in November and settled exactly as Henry had predicted, with Aldous Trent withdrawing his opposition and agreeing to terms that included a formal acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the Rourke property boundaries and the spring water rights. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no courtroom triumph. There was simply a quiet morning in the courthouse, Henry reading the terms in his unhurried voice, and then it was done. Trent left Dusty Creek in December for San Antonio, reportedly to pursue business interests there. Nobody missed him particularly. They had a Christmas supper that included Ida, Henry and his wife, Ruth Carver the schoolteacher, Pete and Miguel, and 3 families from the neighboring properties who had been consistently decent throughout the summer's troubles. The house was warm and smelled of pine and roasted meat, and the apple pie that Celia had been making since she was 12 years old under her father's instruction. Bernard had cut a small cedar tree from the property's north grove and set it in the corner of the parlor with the candles and the few ornaments she had kept from her childhood, and it was so exactly the right thing to do that she had looked at it for a long moment and felt her father's presence in the room in a way that was entirely comfortable and loving. She told Bernard later, in the quiet after the guests had gone, about that feeling. He listened to her, and then he took her hand and held it without saying anything, and after a while he said quietly, "I think he'd have liked me. He'd have respected you," she said, which from him was the higher compliment. He looked at her. "Did he know you were going to be this much of a challenge?" "He absolutely did," she said. "He was delighted about it." Bernard smiled. "Smart man." January brought snow, which was unusual in Dusty Creek and treated by the population as a major event. The white spread across the pastures with a silence and a beauty that Celia had always loved, and she and Bernard rode out to see the ranch under snow in the early morning of the first real snowfall, their breath making clouds in the cold air, the horses picking their way carefully through the white, and she thought that this was what happiness looked like. Not a state but a motion, a continuing and active thing. In February, she told him she was expecting. She told him over breakfast directly, because she had no other mode of delivering important information. She looked at him across the table with her coffee cup between her hands and said, "I believe we are going to have a child." He was very still for a moment. Then he stood up, came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his, and looked at her with an expression that was so entirely unguarded and overwhelmed and full of love that she had to breathe very slowly to stay even-keeled. "Celia," he said. "Yes," she said. He pressed her hands against his chest for a moment. She could feel his heart beating. "Are you well?" He said, "Are you feeling all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I am also somewhat terrified." "Same," he said, and then they laughed together in the February morning light, which was the right response. He wrote to Daniel that afternoon. She wrote to Ida. Ida arrived at the ranch the following morning with enough practical advice and unsolicited opinions about the management of a pregnancy to fill a book, and her genuine, joyful concern was so warm and so real that Celia accepted all of it with gratitude, and only gently redirected the portion that was excessive. The spring of 1879 was the most beautiful spring Celia could remember, though she could not be entirely sure how much of that was the actual weather and how much was the effect of being happy. The cattle operation was strong. The legal troubles were resolved. The community of Dusty Creek, which had watched the events of the previous year with the full investment of a small town in its own drama, had settled into a collective warm regard for the Fairchilds that felt like belonging. Bernard had a natural way with people that she had not initially expected, not the easy sociability of someone who needed company, but a genuine respect for others that made people trust him, and watching him become woven into the community that she had always been part of was one of the quiet pleasures of the year. Pastor Fairweather had become a genuine friend to both of them. He was the kind of man of faith whose faith expressed itself in practical kindness rather than political maneuvering, and who preached on Sunday mornings with a plainness and a warmth that made the chapel feel like a place people actually wanted to be. Celia sat in her family's pew, the third from the front on the left side, every Sunday that she was able to attend, and Bernard sat beside her with the same settled certainty with which he had first sat down in that pew on the morning that had changed everything, and the ordinariness of it, the comfortable and rightful ordinariness of this man beside her in her grandfather's pew, was one of the things she loved most about her life. Their son was born in September, on a Sunday afternoon with Ida Hargrove and the town doctor, Dr. Ambrose Pike, in attendance, during a labor that was hard and long and ultimately completely worth every moment of it. Bernard did not leave the house. He sat in the parlor with his hands locked together and his gray eyes fixed on the ceiling and did not attempt to pretend he was not afraid, which she appreciated. And when Dr. Pike came out and said the words that told him everything was well, the expression on his face was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She was lying in the bedroom with their son in her arms when he came to the doorway, and she looked up and said, "Come and meet him." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small, indignant, absolutely perfect face of their son with an expression of complete astonishment. "He's very small," Bernard said. "He'll grow," she said. He reached out and touched his son's hand very carefully with one finger, and the baby's hand closed around it with the instinctive grip of a new life, and Bernard made a sound that was not quite a word and entirely sufficient. They named him Thomas Daniel Fairchild, Thomas for Celia's father, Daniel for her brother, Fairchild, which was now also her name and which she had not found strange for a single day since she had taken it. She wrote to Daniel that evening, because she knew he would want to know, and he wrote back by return mail with an enthusiasm that covered 3 pages, and concluded with the information that he intended to bring his family to Texas for a proper visit the following summer. His wife Sarah, their daughter Eliza, and the new baby they were expecting themselves. And Celia read that letter to Bernard over breakfast, and they were both very happy about it. The full hearing that had been scheduled regarding the malicious interference claim was formally closed in October, the matter having been resolved by the settlement terms, and Henry Marsh retired from active practice the following spring, with the stated satisfaction of a man who had closed his professional career on a case that had meant something to him. He and his wife remained in Dusty Creek, and his retirement simply meant that he appeared at the Fairchild table for supper more often than he had before. The ranch prospered. Bernard's cattle sense and Celia's operational instincts made a combination that was increasingly well regarded in the county. They expanded the herd carefully, added a second stock hand, and rebuilt the south barn in the fall of 1880, a project that involved most of their neighbors in a barn raising that turned into a two-day celebration. Thomas grew from a solemn, large-eyed infant into a bright and curious toddler who showed every sign of inheriting his mother's stubbornness and his father's methodical patience in approximately equal measure, which made for an extremely interesting child to live with. In the winter of 1881, Celia told Bernard she was expecting again. This time he received the news with rather more composure, though the expression of overwhelmed love was entirely the same. Their second child was a daughter, born in July of 1882 on the hottest day of the year, which she seemed to take as a personal challenge, and arrived with an energy and a volume that suggested she found the whole situation entirely acceptable and was ready to proceed. They named her Mary Elizabeth Fairchild, for both of their mothers. She was, from the very beginning, a person of strong opinions and considerable personality, which her parents found exhausting and delightful in roughly equal measure. Daniel's promised visit had happened in the summer of 1880, and it had been everything Celia had hoped. 2 weeks of full house and noise and children, and long evenings on the porch with her husband and her brother talking in the comfortable way of men who have decided they respect each other. And she had sat in the warm July evenings with her sister-in-law Sarah, who was a practical and good-humored woman with a quick laugh, and felt the particular deep satisfaction of a family that was whole. Dusty Creek itself grew and changed in the years that followed, as all frontier towns did, with new buildings and new families, and the railway that reached them in 1883, and changed the economics of the cattle operation in ways that required adjustment but were ultimately beneficial. Pete Garrow married a woman named Clara who ran the millinery, and Miguel Vasquez acquired a small plot of land south of town and built a house and eventually a small family, and both of them remained in the orbit of the Fairchild Ranch with the unspoken loyalty of men who had stood in the hard years and did not forget it. Ida Hargrove lived to be a very old woman indeed, and remained in possession of her faculties and her sharp opinions to a degree that was genuinely impressive. She attended every significant event in the Fairchild family's life, with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who felt she had had a hand in bringing it into being, which in several meaningful respects she had. Pastor Fairweather christened both Thomas and Mary Elizabeth, and performed the first communion for Thomas in the spring of 1886, and every Sunday morning, the Fairchild family occupied the third pew from the front on the left side of Dusty Creek Chapel, the one that Thomas Rourke's father had hammered together from good Texas oak 3 generations ago, and Celia sat in it with her husband beside her, and thought sometimes about the morning that had set all of this in motion. A new preacher had skipped her pew, and a rancher had loudly made room right beside her. It had been an act of simple decency that had announced itself to a town and to a woman who needed to see it. It had been a statement made in public by a man who understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply stand where you were supposed to stand, clearly and without apology. She thought about it on the Sunday mornings when she walked into the chapel with Thomas's hand in hers and Bernard at her shoulder, and Mary Elizabeth's small voice asking questions that she answered quietly in the way you answer questions in church. And everything about the life she was in had the particular quality of something that had been built right, carefully and honestly, and with full knowledge of what it cost and what it was worth. On their 10th anniversary, Bernard gave her a letter. Not an object, not jewelry, though she wore his mother's ring every day, but a letter, which he pressed into her hand on an August morning in 1888 while Thomas was in school and Mary Elizabeth was with Ida. She sat at the kitchen table and read it. He had written about the creek and the cut fence wire, and the morning she had ridden to his boundary to tell him about the damaged posts. He had written about the church mourning, and the deliberate scrape of his pew across the floor, and how much he had wanted to simply say what was true. He had written about the bluebonnets in the meadow and the ring in his coat pocket, and what it had cost him to wait until the timing was right because waiting had never been so difficult. He had written about 10 years of mornings and evenings and ordinary days and impossible seasons, and that the ordinary days were the treasure, the ones that seemed unremarkable when they were in them, but that were in fact the whole substance of a life. He had written, "You asked me once what I did things for. I do them for this, for the exact shape of this life, for you." She set the letter down on the table and looked at the kitchen window where the morning light was coming in, and the sound of his voice was in the yard with the hands, directing the morning work with his particular calm authority. She went to the door and called his name. He looked up from across the yard. "Come here," she said. He came across the yard and up the steps, and she took his face in her hands and kissed him with the conviction of a woman who had been doing this for 10 years and intended to do it for 50 more. Against her mouth he said, "Good morning." "Perfect morning," she said. The ranch land lay around them in the August sunlight, all 200 Rourke acres, and the adjoining 300 Fairchild acres that had been combined in practice, though not always in formal record. Though the legal arrangements had been made very tidy by Henry Marsh in his last year of practice. And the grass was summer gold, and the creek ran with the constancy it had always had, the spring that had never gone dry in living memory feeding it through dry years and wet years alike. Thomas Fairchild would grow up to be a man who understood land the way his parents did, who would one day take over the management of the combined operation with the same methodical passion that had built it, and would also, though this was still years away, meet a young woman named Clara at the Dusty Creek Autumn Fair, and fall in love with the particular helpless certainty of someone who recognizes what they have been looking for without having known they were looking. Mary Elizabeth Fairchild would grow up to be her own extraordinary self, would study to be a teacher like Ruth Carver, who had been her mother's friend, would take a teaching position in the town school, and then a larger position in San Antonio, and would write home every week without fail, with the faithful love of a daughter who understood what home was worth. But all of that was ahead of them, in the accumulated days of a life that had been built out of decency and stubbornness, and two people deciding to stand beside each other. On that August morning in 1888, Celia and Bernard Fairchild stood on their porch in the sunshine of the Texas summer, and the world was their particular corner of it, earned and loved and entirely, completely theirs. She still had the bluebonnets, dried, preserved, in a small glass box on the shelf above her father's Bible, which still sat on her desk in the room that had been his study and was now hers. She kept them there not as sentiment alone, but as reminder, not of the legal trouble or the deliberate skip of a manipulative stranger or the cold calculation of men who had underestimated her, but of the moment on the chapel steps when Bernard Fairchild had walked beside her into the sunlight and looked at the world with her, and she had understood that this was what courage looked like in its daily form, not the dramatic gesture but the sustained and unwavering standing beside. He had sat down beside her in her grandfather's pew and told the entire town something true. And then he had spent every day afterward living that truth, in fence lines and kitchen tables and porch evenings and the warm, ordinary dailiness of a shared life, and she had lived it with him. That, she thought, as the morning moved around them and the horses in the corral moved and the sounds of the ranch came in on the warm air, was the whole of it. That was everything.